Hello and welcome to today's webcast, brought to you by the Center on Knowledge Translation for Disability and Rehabilitation Research, or KTDRR, at American Institutes for Research, or AIR, in coordination with the Campbell Collaboration. The Center on KTDRR is funded by the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research, known as NIDLR, in the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, Administration for Community Living. The Campbell Collaboration is an international organization that promotes positive change through the production and use of systematic reviews and other evidence synthesis for evidence-based policy and practice. The Center on KTDRR partners with Campbell's Disability Coordinating Group, or DCG, to help increase the number of Campbell reviews in the disability field. I'm Joanne Starks from the Austin, Texas office of AIR, and I will be the moderator today. I also want to thank my colleagues Shoshana Rabinovsky and Ariana Haversmith, who are helping with the logistics. The KTDRR Center and the Campbell Collaboration are working together to offer a 5-part training course that focuses on high-quality methods for synthesis of evidence, including the procedures and methods for conducting systematic reviews, as well as software, tools, and strategies for analyzing and reporting data. We kicked off the series in February with Dr. Terry Piggott providing an overview of systematic reviews and research syntheses, followed in March by Dr. Piggott presenting basic steps and procedures for a Campbell systematic review. Last month, the 3rd session on management analysis tools for reviews introduced 4 different software packages to assist teams in keeping track of studies and data for their systematic reviews. Today, we are privileged to have Dr. Howard White on hand to discuss strategies other than systematic reviews for reporting data, primarily evidence gap maps, or EGMs. Howard is leading efforts with the Campbell Collaboration to develop EGMs with and for different agencies. Today, he will talk about evidence gap maps and provide a number of examples on the use and usefulness of this strategy. Howard is Campbell's Chief Executive Officer. He was the founding executive director of the International Initiative for Impact Evaluation, or 3IE, and before that led the Impact Evaluation Program of the World Bank's Independent Evaluation Group. He started his career as an academic researcher at the Institute of Social Studies in The Hague and the Institute of Development Studies, University of Sussex. Howard, are you ready to begin?
Yes, thank you, Joanne. So thank you, Joanne, for the introduction. And as Joanne mentioned, I'm going to be talking primarily about evidence and gap maps and what we call other initiative reporting strategies at the end of the presentation, which are various other ways in which evidence can be presented. So first of all, we will talk about what are evidence and gap maps, and then provide a short overview of the history of mapping, and the bulk of the presentation will focus on different types of maps which are addressing different types of research evidence. But to begin, what is a map? An evidence and gap map is a systematic presentation of all available relevant evidence for a particular sector or subsector. And the way that maps are presented these days, and we're going to be seeing many examples during this presentation, are a tabular or matrix format in which different intervention categories are in the rows of the matrix and different outcomes are in the columns of the matrix, and the cells of the matrix present the available evidence for that particular combination of interventions and outcomes. As I said, we'll see several examples of that in the second half of the presentation. So maps live in the evidence synthesis space shown in this particular diagram. So what we're mostly familiar with are systematic reviews up in the top left-hand corner of this diagram, and systematic reviews of the sort that were presented by Terry Piggott in earlier lectures in this series present the summary of what the evidence says based on a summary review of what we call the primary studies. Those are the relevant studies to address the research question being assessed. But there are other types of evidence synthesis products we can produce. The next along the chain is review of reviews, where rather than reviewing primary studies, the authors review existing reviews. So you could pick an area in which there are many reviews already in an international development context. That would apply, for example, to conditional cash transfers. There are many reviews of looking at different outcomes of those interventions. In a domestic context, there are many reviews of child protection policies, and so you might look at do a review of reviews there. And so the unit of analysis in those reviews are the systematic reviews rather than the primary studies. Next along the chain, evidence and gap maps that we're going to be talking about today. And evidence and gap maps present the available what evidence is available in both systematic reviews, that's SR, systematic reviews, and primary studies. Next along the line is a mega map, which we're going to meet later on, which only shows other reviews and other maps. And finally, a map of maps, which we'll also be meeting later on, that only shows other maps. And as the diagram shows, there's a trade-off between what we call the scope of the evidence synthesis product and the content or the depth of content. So as you go across the horizontal axis, the scope of the evidence synthesis product is getting broader. So for example, the only map of maps we have to date covers the whole of international development. It's a very broad scope. The mega map covers all of child welfare in low middle income countries. Again, a very broad scope. Whereas a systematic review might look at the topic, for example, the role of assistive devices for people with disabilities in improving their learning outcomes. So it's a much more specific, focused question. And as the scope gets narrower in that way, so the depth of analysis, the content gets deeper. And so systematic reviews can really dig down into the primary studies and unpack the causal chain, the theory of change, underlying the intervention, and explore heterogeneity of impact across the studies and so on. A review of reviews, because it relies on the information reported in reviews, not the primary studies, will generally have a broader scope, possibly covering a broader range of interventions or outcomes or both, but not be able to dig so deeply into the evidence because it's reliant only on the evidence reported in reviews, not the primary studies themselves. An important breakpoint comes in this diagram at evidence and gap maps. Because evidence and gap maps, EGMs, the mega map and maps of maps, which are types of map, only tell you what evidence is available. They do not tell you what the evidence says. And that's a very important point to note. At least insofar as the maps that Campbell is supporting the production of, the maps are a way of displaying the available evidence, not of summarizing what the evidence says. And there's important theoretical reasons why we believe strongly in that approach, that again I will refer to as we go on. So whilst maps are very popular when you speak to commissioners of research, funders of research, funders of programs, and mention maps, they get very excited and want to have one. You have to really be very clear to them that this will only tell you what evidence is available. It will not summarize what that evidence says. As I will go on to say later on, it's a basis for then exploring what the evidence says and helps you take decisions about where to synthesize the evidence, but the map itself does not present that synthesis of what the evidence says. So in addition to the overall framework of the map in the rows and the columns present the matrix, there are additional filters, what we call filters, which might be country, might be region, might be study design, might be population subgroups like youth, women, people with disabilities, people in humanitarian contexts. These are all different common filters that would apply to a map, so the user can then select the filter and filter the evidence to only show that evidence corresponding to that particular filter or subpopulation, such as a region, say only evidence from North America, because the maps, as any synthesis, are global or across broad regions. If you want to see evidence from a particular country or particular region, then the filter allows you to do so. Again, emphasizing that the maps only show evidence is there, not what the evidence says. And finally, the evidence might be global or particular regions. So we do have in Campbell both global maps, but also maps that cover particular regions, specifically low middle income countries. The map might show primary studies and reviews. It might show just one of those. Most of them would show both. And most particularly, the maps can cover different types of evidence. So to date, most of the maps we have, just like most of the reviews we have, are effectiveness reviews. So they're studies that look at the effectiveness of interventions, what effect those interventions have on the outcomes of interest. So I mentioned, for example, the role of assistive devices for people with disabilities to the impact on their attending, education, and the learning outcomes they achieve. That's an effectiveness intervention. But you can also carry out maps and other evidence synthesis for any research question. It's simply a method that can be applied to any research question. And we're going to see in this presentation, the thing I chose to focus on is the way in which we've been innovating in the types of maps we've been doing to cover a broader range of research questions and therefore different types of evidence to effectiveness studies. So we're going to see examples of both effectiveness maps, but also maps covering other types of research design. Before moving on to that, it should be very clear that evidence mapping is nothing new. In our review of looking at the history of evidence mapping, we found the first evidence mapping using that terminology going back to early 2000s, but that was a descriptive overview of the evidence. Similarly, in the same year, Epicenter, a systematic review group based in London, started using the term systematic mapping to map the evidence that was available. But at this point, they were presenting maps not in pictorial form, but as descriptive overview of the evidence with graphs showing the breakdown by theme, by country, by outcome, and so on. They weren't doing the pictorial representation of the maps in the matrix form, which began in 2010 when the International Initiative for Impact Evaluation, 3IE, first started doing maps. The first map 3IE worked on was in health and nutrition impact agricultural interventions. But since that time, 3IE has now been associated with over 20 maps, and many other organisations working in international development have worked with 3IE, organisations like USAID, International Rescue Committee, both in the US, obviously, but Sight Savers in the UK, an NGO working on people with sight impairments, have done evidence mapping, again working with 3IE. So that's really been an important turning point as the work of 3IE promoting evidence mapping, and Campbell has built in particular on that approach. But you see, other organisations have been adopting mapping as we go through time, and if we go to the next slide, we'll see the continuation of mapping. I think quite important to point out here is Epistemonicus, which is an online database for health studies, health impact evaluations, and systematic reviews. So they are effectiveness studies, and it does have a mapping utility to map the evidence for particular sectors or questions that you choose to specify in Epistemonicus. And then, importantly to us and for this presentation, in 2017, so 2 years ago now, Campbell developed the guidelines and standards and so on for producing evidence of gap maps according to Campbell criteria. And you'll see I also mentioned on this slide, as I mentioned already, the work of Sight Savers working on interventions for people with visual impairments in developing countries, and International Rescue Committee, which works mainly in humanitarian contexts and has also developed a number of evidence tools, including evidence maps, working with the 3IE. So you see now in this slide, as I've already mentioned, there's been a large increase in interest in mapping in recent years. This has been in international development fueled in quite a large part by 3IE's own work or the work that's been supported by 3IE. So this is a graph taken from the map of maps I've mentioned already. The map of maps shows 79 ongoing or completed maps in international development space. This is a study undertaken 2 years ago now, so it's a bit dated. We know at least another 20 maps have started since then. And from this graph, you see very clearly the rapid rise in mapping from 2013 through the 3 years up to 2016. 2017 is not a drop-off like that. The study was undertaken in mid-2017, so 2017 maps weren't yet available to be identified to go into this graph. Once we update this study later this year, I'd fully expect the steep year-on-year increase you see in this graph to continue into 2017 and indeed into 2018. So a large increase in doing evidence maps in recent years. This is just in international development, but if you were to look also in other areas like in social welfare, like child protection in developed countries, then I'm aware of many maps being commissioned in those policy spaces as well. So there's been a big increase in the number of maps being commissioned in recent years, and more follow the sort of visual presentations I'm going to be showing you in the second half of this talk. The important point about maps and why they're part of this lecture series is evidence and gap maps are a systematic product following the same principles of evidence synthesis as does a systematic review, following the procedures that have been explained in the previous talks in this lecture, and that in this lecture series. And that's why I'm not going to go in detail to explaining how you do the map, because the idea of having PICOs, of having a clear ex-ante search strategy, systematic implementation of a search strategy, reporting of search strategy, systematic coding of studies, systematic reporting of your study of what you find, all of that is the same for a map as it is for review. Where there are differences, I will mention those now, but the similarities are much greater than the differences. Evidence and gap maps are a systematic product in the same way systematic reviews are. So you specify the scope of the map, having a PICOs, the population intervention, comparison groups, outcomes, and study designs, just as you would for a systematic review. But most importantly, and I'll come back to this in a moment, you define the scope of the map with the framework that defines the interventions and outcomes for the matrix and defines the filters. These help define your search strategy and your coding form. So it's very important that at the actually protocol stage or even the title registration stage you go through with Campbell, that you specify clearly what the framework for the map is. So you have to have a pre-specified protocol for a map saying what you're going to do, how you're going to do your analysis. This is standard for a Campbell product, and it's necessary for maps as it is for systematic reviews. So you have to have a systematic search strategy that says where you're going to search and how you're going to search. So a search strategy has two components: where you're going to search, which databases, which websites, which journals you're going to search, and how you're going to search, which are the search strings or the key search terms you're going to use. So just as for a systematic review, the protocol has to specify the search strategy. Similarly, for evidence and gap map, the protocol has to specify the search strategy. Once you've done the search, you've got your search results, then you need to have your screening using clear, transparent, ex-ante inclusion-exclusion criteria. Note that because the scope of a map will be generally broader than the scope of review, you're going to get many more hits. So in a review, you tend to expect to get 2,000 to 3,000 hits. You might get up to 10,000, but it'd be unusual for a review. Whereas for a map, getting 20,000 or more hits is not at all unusual. We're working on a map right now where we started with 70,000 hits to be screened. Because the scope is so broad, you find a lot more potentially relevant studies that have to be screened. And so that's one difference. The procedure is the same, but the amount of work involved in the screening is going to be more because you have to go through a lot more studies. Of course, a lot can be done on title and abstract screening, so it goes fairly quickly, but you do need to go through that procedure. And for a Campbell map, like a Campbell review, has to be double screened, at least at the start. If you can get consensus of your screeners and coders at around 85%, and you can report that, then you can do single screening with a random check of a random sample by a supervisor. And that's a procedure we're allowing now in our maps for a very large number of studies to be screened. As I mentioned, the screening needs you to have very clear inclusion and exclusion criteria, just like for a review. And then you need to code the studies. This is another difference, because maps only say what evidence is there, not what the evidence says. The coding required for a map is far less per study than the coding required for a review. Because when you're coding for a review, particularly effective review, you have to code all the effect sizes and the associated statistics, sample size for treatment control groups, standards of the outcomes, and so on. And you have to then code also subsample analysis, subsample characteristics, and so on. You don't need any of that when you're coding for a map. You just need the basic bibliographic information, you need the interventions and outcomes, and you need to have any filters you're applying, like study design, country for study, and so on. Basic information you expect to collect. And it's normally relatively simple to code. So with the coding form for a map, it depends on the map, but it's not unreasonable to expect to be able to code for 3 to 4 studies an hour. So you can actually manage maybe 20 a day. Whereas for a review, you often expect it to take 2 to 3 days to code a single study, depending on how deep the review is going. And so there's a big difference in terms of coding time for study. A map can have more studies. The review might only have 10 or 12 included studies, a map can have 200. So the total coding time might be similar or even more for a map, but the time required for study is far less. Because when it comes to the last bullet point, systematic reporting of biological studies, that means putting them into the map and reporting them in your tables of the distribution of the evidence, but you don't have to actually synthesize the evidence. So the stage of analysis is also much quicker for a map because you're doing univariate, bivariate tabulations of what evidence is there by study design, by country, and so on. You're not doing detailed analysis of content, qualitative synthesis of the barriers and facilitators, and so on. So the synthesis component, you can do it in half a day or a day in an evidence and gap map, which you certainly can't do for systematic review. So typically, while a Campbell review might take 12 to 18 months or longer, a Campbell map can be done in 6 to 12 months. The work on a map can be done in less than 6 months. Going through the Campbell review process means it takes a bit longer, but the time required for the actual production, again depending on the scope and number of studies, is typically 3 to 6 months. A key component of that is the framework. The framework is the key component of the evidence and gap map. And to repeat, the framework of intervention and outcome categories, and then any additional filters you want to code. But it's getting the intervention and outcome categories right that is certainly key, and that needs to have stakeholder engagement, some sort of consultative process with stakeholders to get something they will recognize and buy into. Because if you put something out there where they say, well, I don't recognize where's this intervention, where's that intervention, I can't find it, I don't understand these categories, then you're going to undermine the credibility and use of the product. So we adopt a couple of approaches. One is that we look at existing strategies that are out there in the particular sector, and where there is an existing framework, then we use that. So we have done an evidence and gap map on interventions for people with disabilities in low-income countries. And for that, we used the WHO community-based rehabilitation matrix for both the intervention categories and the outcome categories. And we did that because the CBR is commonly recognized amongst government and international agencies working with people with disabilities. And so by using that framework, we knew we'd get acceptance of what we had done rather than inventing our own or take one from a particular agency. We took one that had already universal acceptance. Where you haven't got that, we're doing a map on access to justice, where there's no such framework and no such consensus. Then you have to try and look at strategies to identify what that framework should look like and go through stakeholder consultation with intended users to get agreement around that framework. So when there's an existing framework you can use, designing the framework takes a little time. It can take a week maximum. But where you need to go for a consultative process, it can take 2 or 3 months. It depends on how long the consultation is, whether you use physical meetings to do it or whatever. Again, just as with reviews, Campbell maps are strongly advised to have an advisory board. And that advisory board should comprise both academic experts in the area, but also practitioners and policymakers in the area. And the advisory board are amongst the groups we're using to help advise you on the framework and to get them to agree to the framework. There are some caveats there I will come back to when we see some actual maps. So let's move on to some examples. The first examples we're going to see are not the Campbell or 3i, not the Campbell maps. We will start with 3i example, but there's a wide variety of mapping formats out there. It's interesting to take a look at some of those because you may feel your organisation would like something different to what we have, and so it's good for you to see the range of choices which are out there. So the first example here is 3IE map, and so this is as described earlier, and this example comes from adolescent and sexual reproductive health. So the interventions are in the rows, and the intervention categories and then subcategories, and typically you'd want to have around 20 to 25 subcategories. So 5 to 6, maybe even 4 intervention categories, and then within that 4 to 6 subcategories for each of those, and similarly 5 or 6 outcome categories. That's in the columns. You see here 5, and then within each of those 4 to 6 outcome subcategories. So your dimensions of your matrix should be around 20 to 26 rows, 20 to 26 columns. Any more than that, it gets harder to navigate. You won't fit on a single page. And in particular, though, what we find is that once you get more disaggregated than that, it becomes harder to code as well. You haven't got such clarity and distinction between the different categories once you start to disaggregate too much. So the principle, which I'll repeat again later, for designing your framework is to try and go for a small number of large holes rather than a lot of small holes. But don't try and get too fine and disaggregated matrix. It's going to be less usable in the end. So people will drive you to it, think it'll be more useful. It won't be, it'll be less useful. So now, but going back to looking at the content of the map, as you look across the top row, which is provider training and youth-friendly service adjustments, and we go across to the health service column, where the first of those is accessing and utilising health services. And the top cell there in that row has a big red dot and a big grey dot. So in the 3IE maps, the grey dots correspond to impact evaluations. And the larger the circle, the more impact evaluations there are. The coloured dots correspond to systematic reviews, and they're colour-coded by what we call strength confidence in the evidence. From low, which is red, to medium, which is orange, and green, which is high. We also include in the map ongoing reviews, which are coded blue. If this were a live version of the map, you can hover over a particular circle and get a list of all the studies there. So if there are 16 studies in that circle, it will list all 16 studies. So for primary studies, it will tell you the author, the year, and the country, and often then on the map, the study title. And you can, from that list, click on any one of those studies and click through to the database record for that study, which gives a link or summarizes the study and gives a link to the URL. So these maps not only display the evidence in an easy to understand, navigable way, they also actually take you through to see to find the evidence, find the underlying study. So that's an important function of the map, is putting the studies back into the public domain. And I mentioned this a few times. It makes the evidence discoverable and accessible, and therefore usable. So because many people would not be able to discover these studies because they're in databases people won't know how to use or don't go to, and they can't access them, so they can't find how to get them. The access is there both because of a database summary, which goes beyond the abstract, but also because of a link to the URL. Now, URL might then be behind a paywall, and there's nothing we can do about that. Maybe the institution has a subscription, maybe it doesn't. But the user, depending on who they are, may be able to access the actual research article as well. If not, they do get a summary in the database record. So maps play an important role in surfacing evidence for systematic search and putting that evidence out there so it can be more discovered, more accessible. And we've seen that in some examples I'll come back to in the second half of the presentation as being a primary function of that. Here's the site savers map. It looks a bit similar to 3i map, but actually has some very important differences. So all of the site savers maps are related to disabilities with visual disabilities, visual impairments, and this one is for cataracts. And if you look across the top row where the column headings are, you'll see that they have a number of outcomes around burden disease, biomedical outcomes, service delivery outcomes, and health systems outcomes. And then each circle in this map is review. So this map only includes reviews, doesn't include primary studies. And then they're color-coded in exactly the same way I described before. Red is low confidence, meaning we're not really sure we can trust the review findings or shortcomings in the review. Medium confidence and high confidence. And you'll see the majority of studies are coded red. That's not unusual. To make this assessment, which is called critical appraisal, is something we also do in systematic reviews. We critically appraise include studies. Site savers use the SURE checklist. You can Google this, look online, you'll find there are quite a large number of checklists for critical appraisal. And actually the group that produce SURE, they're at Cardiff in the UK, they have a website that gives a list of critical appraisal tools for different types of research designs, including reviews, but also different types of primary studies. And so site savers use the SURE checklist to critically appraise the included reviews and decide whether they're high confidence or low confidence. The other thing they do in this map is to say whether the evidence supports the intervention, if there's an effect or not. So you see down the left-hand column, it says strong, inconclusive, and weak. So that's where the review concludes there's weak evidence of any effects, inconclusive evidence of effects, and strong evidence of effects. Now, in this case, because they're basing it on reviews, I don't object so much to that approach. When we come to the next map, I'm going to show you I do object more strongly. But we're not that keen on that approach for reasons I will spell out in a moment. And you'll see, I'll leave to that. But I do encourage you to look at the Site Savers map and to explore it. If any of these maps, they're all online, all available online. You can access them and explore them. So here's the evidence-based policing matrix. This is one of the older maps that's around, and this map shows primary studies, not reviews. So all of it, every single dot is a primary study, and this has multiple dimensions. There's 3 dimensions you can see, and the fourth dimension is given by the color coding. That 4th dimension of color coding is, and shape, because I have also this triangle, is to do with the effect. So the upside down red triangle means the intervention actually has an adverse effect, whereas the black circle is, if I recall correctly, a positive effect, and white circle is null effect, and grey is what they call mixed findings from the single study. So that would be positive effects on some outcomes, not on some measures and not other measures. Because in this map, there's only one outcome, and that outcome is the impact on crime rates. There are 3 other dimensions, so I'll go through them very briefly. On the horizontal axis, the x-axis, you have what they call the scope or target, going from whether it's an intervention target individuals, groups, what they call microplaces, which is like a block, a neighbourhood, which is a larger space, or then a jurisdiction, which is a larger geographical area still, or nation state. Then they have specificity of prevention mechanism, so whether it's a very focused prevention mechanism focused on that particular group, or whether it's a more general one that's intended to affect that group, and then level of proactivity, which whether it's something that police go out and do, whether it's something that's in place and is a reactive intervention to things that happen. And so the interventions are coded by those different categories. Now, why we object to this, if you look at the studies down in the bottom left-hand corner, for example, you will find they all correspond to the same intervention. And what this design of the map encourages you to do is what we call vote counting, which Terry may have spoken about in her lecture. Vote counting says, okay, well, you see there are roughly 10 studies there, half of them, okay, there are 11 studies there, 5 of them find no effect at all, 3 have mixed findings, 2 say a positive impact, 1 say negative impact. So overall, looks a bit mixed, the evidence, we're not really sure, but maybe it works on balance, because 2 say it works, 1 say it doesn't. That's not the correct way to synthesize evidence. The correct way to synthesize evidence is through meta-analysis. And so because maps like this can lead you to report study effects, because the map report study effects. When the map report study effects, it encourages the user to engage in vote counting. And at Campbell, we're very, 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 very opposed to vote counting. We believe in meta-analysis. And so we think we're showing in the map what the finding of the individual studies is actually counterproductive. It leads people all down into bad habits of vote counting. We're strongly opposed to it. So in the Campbell maps, like in the 3i maps, we present what evidence is there, but our coding of the studies represents confidence study findings, doesn't tell you what the studies say. But that's our view, it's not everyone's view. So the final map I'm going to show you, which is the 5D bubble plot, which are produced by Veterans Affairs in the United States, they again show you what the evidence says. We don't mind so much because it comes from reviews, so we mind less when the summary evidence says comes from reviews, like with site savers, than single studies, but still we'd rather leave that to doing the evidence synthesis yourself. So on the horizontal axis, they have evidence of no effect on the far left, unclear evidence in the middle, and evidence of positive effect on the right-hand side. The bubbles have various sizes, and the key is in the top left-hand corner there. And so the larger the bubble, the more reviews there are in that bubble. These bubbles are color-coded into sets of interventions. So you see the various blue bubbles, light blue bubbles, are hypertension. So you see sort of in the evidence of positive effect column at the far right, the top one of those is that blue bubble which says hypertension on it. There's other hypertension bubbles in the middle section. And so the color coding corresponds to an intervention class, and then there's specific intervention categories. It's like our intervention categories and subcategories. The color coding captures the categories, individual bubbles refer to subcategories. And then they have a vertical axis which corresponds to literature size. So that's the number of articles, impact evaluations, there are in the reviews of that particular intervention subcategory. So whilst they don't synthesize or map the individual studies, they do tell you how big is this literature, which is quite a useful thing to know. I think that's one thing I like about the 5D bubble plot, is that it shows you how big the literature is. So you can see that the health outcomes in this particular map, there's a large number of studies, whereas for most of them, they're lying on the bottom there, there's just 0 or 1 studies. So it's not a lot of evidence actually to synthesize. The reviews don't have many included studies. So there's a whole different number of ways in which these maps can be presented. And you can read about those in our discussion paper, which you'll find online on the Campbell website. We go through all those different agencies and discuss their approaches and how they've done these maps, and basically what we think are the pros and cons, strengths and weaknesses of each approach, which we looked at in order to inform the development of the Campbell standards and approach to doing these maps. So now I'm going to talk about what I call evidence mapping initiatives. These are different maps we're doing in Campbell, which show the scope of maps you can do, the sort of research questions you can approach, and so the innovations that I think we've been undertaking in order to push the frontier of what's being done with evidence mapping. So we're going to look at the map of maps, the mega map, and so on. We're going to go through these examples right now. The first one we've mentioned already is the map of maps of effective international development interventions. So this is a very broad map that has an extra large scope. So it's all of international development. And because its scope is so large, we've only included other evidence of gap maps. We don't include reviews, we don't include primary studies, there'd be thousands of them. We only include other evidence and gap maps. And so it looks like this. This is the version published a couple of years ago, and it had, so actually 73, I said 79, 73 maps, which 55 were completed and 18 ongoing. And just as in the other maps we've seen, there are different outcome intervention categories in the rows, outcomes of rural development, climate change and environment, conflict management, and so on. And then different outcomes, which are the sustainable development goals, in the columns. And you can hover over any one of these circles. The circle size corresponds to the number of maps, and you can click on the circle to access the actual maps themselves, description of the maps, and link to the URL for the maps. With this map, what we find is that I didn't have a slide on that. Majority of internet maps to date are in health. Any map you do, you'll find there are many more studies in health now than any other area. And we identified underrepresented areas. So this map was produced by 3IE as part of its work what's called CEDL. CEDL is the Centre for Excellence in Development, Impact and Learning. CEDL, you can Google it and find it, which is a consortium involving 3IE and Campbell amongst others. And so 3IE made the map of maps published by CEDL, and UK Department of International Development, DFID, is financing CEDL, used the map to identify 3 areas, of which the disability map was one, I've already mentioned that, access to justice, I've already mentioned, was another one, and transport was the third, and we're doing maps in those 3 areas based on the fact that the map of maps showed these were under-mapped areas. And so we want to do a map now to look in more detail. Well, there's no maps there. Let's see if there are reviews there, if there are primary studies there. And just to mention, because it's of interest to this particular community, we found very few studies, fewer than 100 studies in disability, which is a very small number, particularly in Africa. Most of the studies we found are in China and Iran and Turkey. Reasonable number in India, but not many studies at all for large parts of the world. So map and maps is one innovation we've done by mapping, not reviews, not primary studies, but mapping maps. The second innovation, actually was the first, because this is the first one we did, is the mega map on child welfare. Again, I've mentioned this. So it's the evidence and gap map has a large scope. So mega map the map has a very broad scope. This has a large scope of all of child welfare, health, nutrition, education, child protection, and so on. And so it doesn't include primary studies, because again, there would be thousands of them, particularly in health. It only includes other maps and systematic reviews. And so it looks like the other map. Oh, where's it gone? So it looks like any other map. Here it is. They're only coloured circles because it's showing only the reviews. There are no primary studies, and we've done a critical appraisal of the included studies. And so you have red are low confidence. Oops, sorry, gone back. Red is low confidence. Green is high confidence, and orange is medium confidence. You'll see there are quite a lot of studies here. There are over 300 reviews. This actually is the first version we published. We've updated it recently with Great Literature Search, and there are now around 250 reviews in the map. And what you'll see here, I think I've got the slide. Yes, so the majority of studies, about 2/3 of the studies, are in health, and nearly most of the rest are in early child development and education. So a study might be coded as being in more than one of these areas. So you'll see actually nearly every map covers the health sector amongst its outcomes, but the others a lot of the others cover ECD and education. And then areas like social protection, governance, social work and welfare, and these include child rights, child protection, trafficking and so on, but also actually some disability-related issues. They have far less coverage, far fewer reviews in those areas. So because this is a mega map, it only contains maps and reviews, we can't say there's no evidence in these areas. We can say there's no evidence synthesis in these areas. So there's an absence of evidence synthesis in these areas. Whether there's no evidence, we'd need to do a map to find out. So the use of this map has been precisely to say, well, we can see that in these areas around what we call the new areas of child rights, so around child abuse and trafficking and so on, there's very little evidence synthesis. And so UNICEF have commissioned Campbell to do a violence against children evidence and gap map to see, well, is it really true there are no studies in this area? And we have the preliminary findings. There are some studies, but again, it's another map where there are fewer than 100. And when you're doing something as broad as a map, and violence against children includes both abuse and neglect, so it's fairly broad scope, covering a fairly broad range of interventions. When you find so few studies, then that's a fairly sparsely populated map. So we are finding from that map the scenario without much evidence. It's not true of all maps we do. So the mega map again is an innovation because we've looked at broad scope, looking just at reviews in the map, not primary studies and reviews. The next example is a homeless effective map. So this is a more standard map where we've looked at homelessness, primarily in developed countries. We're doing this for the What Center for Homelessness in the UK, the Centre for Homelessness Impact. And so it's looking at effectiveness studies, impact evaluations and reviews. And the innovation was we did critical appraisal, all included studies. So hitherto maps have done critical appraisal reviews. I haven't done critical appraisal of the primary studies because there's a lot of them. And doing critical appraisal of primary studies is just a lot of work. But we undertook to do it. And so we did that. And so in the map here, you can see, though not quite so well, the red dots, you can see from the key at the bottom, is low quality. We use the word quality because it fitted, but we should say low confidence study findings of primary studies is red. Medium or high quality, which are not so many, is green for primary studies. And orange is low quality reviews, and a different shade of green is medium to high quality reviews. If you look up numbers at the top, you'll see there are 238 impact evaluations and only 22 reviews. This is a very under-reviewed area. If you do a map in a health-related area, like disability, there are as many reviews as there are primary studies, which is perhaps going a bit too far. But in areas where there's a lot of public health research, which is true of disability, you find a lot of reviews, because health researchers do reviews. And so the number of reviews will be equal to even more than the number of included studies. Here in homelessness, there's not a tradition of doing reviews. It's outside of the health sector, in health interventions in the sector. Outside of the health interventions, you don't see a lot of reviews being done. And so there's an under-reviewed area, which is one of the important messages of this particular map. But the innovation here was to do critical appraisal of the included, all included studies. And so what's being done with this map is to identify the areas where there are studies where we can do a review, and already the Centre's commissioned 3 Campbell reviews to use the evidence identified in the maps, do standard reviews in those particular areas around increasing access to health for people with homelessness, for example. Moving on to the next innovation is, again, on homelessness, but now what we've done is to map the process evaluations, not the impact evaluations. So the scope is the same, it's homelessness, but we're looking at process evaluations, implementation studies. And they are very different, and they come from a very different sort of background. So in the homelessness map, you saw there are 238 included studies. They're nearly all North America. They're nearly all the US and Canada. They're just 12 from the UK. Now, we've done that map for a UK organisation who knew that was going to be the case, so they need to sell that map to a domestic audience, and including academic research in the UK working with homelessness. None of whose studies are included in the map because they don't do impact evaluations. So one way we've addressed that is to do a map of process evaluations, nearly a quarter of which do come from the UK, because we're only doing it in English language. So again, most of them from the US, nearly a quarter are from the UK. But the important innovation here, really, was that these are nearly all grey literature. These process evaluations are not even in Scholar Google, which is normally quite good finding grey literature. They're certainly not in Open Grey or anything like that, where you would normally try and search for grey literature. So the way we found them was by going through every single state in the US, every single county in the UK, every single state or province in Australia and Canada, going to the relevant website, the relevant agency, and searching on that website or going for their publication list of that agency on their website, and then going to the main research agencies like AER, like Abt Associates, Mathematica, and so on, going to their websites and searching their websites also for studies they've been involved in, and similar research agencies in the UK, but NGOs active in this sector, searching their websites. And so it's very much a website-based search strategy, not a database search strategy. So when you're doing an effectiveness study, most of the evaluations will come from the database searches, which are supplementary website searches. In this case, nearly all the literature in the map, and there are 220 odd process evaluations, I think it is, and I would say nearly 200 of those came from the website. In the map itself, the columns are no longer outcomes. The columns are barriers and facilitators. So we developed a framework of barriers and facilitators, Dorman Implementation Science Framework, and we ran that by, first of all, a qualitative researcher we work with in the social sector, but then through the UK Academics on Homelessness to get a coding framework. And actually we then worked with a group in Edinburgh to work on homelessness, to do the coding of these process evaluations, to look at the barriers and facilitators of interventions for people experiencing homelessness. And so, whilst we say that maps don't tell what the evidence says, that's not really entirely true of the process evaluations map, because the process evaluation map does tell you what are identified as being the main barriers and facilitators to successful implementation of intervention for people experiencing homelessness. And so the gaps, the empty cells in this map don't represent there being evidence in this map, which they do in a traditional effectiveness map. They represent this has not been identified as a barrier facilitator. We have to get that correct. We can't say it's not a barrier facilitator. We have to say it's not been identified as one. So it may have been one, but not been identified in the process evaluations that didn't look at it. We always have to be careful on what we say and we don't say. So this map, these two maps are being in a couple of ways. One is that we are doing the systematic reviews, and they're going to include the process evaluations, mixed method reviews, so they include the process evaluation evidence as well. But the second is that they're building an intervention tool, an evidence portal, which I'll show you in the next few minutes in the concluding section of this talk, when we talk about different ways of presenting evidence. And so evidence summaries are being produced from the process evaluations around the issues identified as barriers and facilitators in the process evaluation map. Having done the first map process evaluations on homelessness, the next time we've done that is in the Uganda country evidence and gap map. So Uganda is a country where I have quite a strong association for a number of years, and I was there last summer doing a presentation to the Uganda Evaluation Association. And just as a question while I was doing the presentation, I asked people, how many randomized controlled trials do you think have been carried out of development interventions in Uganda? And some people said none, others were saying, well, 9 or 10, and that was the highest guess I got. Now, 3i has a database of development impact evaluations, so I checked the 3i database, I had done for the talk, and there were 92 randomized controlled trials of development impact evaluations had been carried out. And so I then looked at all impact evaluations, and I found over 220 impact evaluations carried out in Uganda. So I thought, what about process evaluations? I did a quick scoping of those, and I figured, well, there's over 200 of those as well. So since 2000, there have been around 500 evaluations of development interventions in Uganda. And the fact is that most people don't know most of those studies are there. So this noted gap map, but its scope is to include all evaluations, whatever kind, process evaluations, impact evaluations, and formative evaluations carried out of development interventions in the last 18 years. And so we put that map together now. This is a snapshot of it. The green circles are the impact evaluations, the blue circles are the process evaluations, and there is a top left-hand cell, there's a small orange dot, that's formative evaluation. There are only 7 in the map, so you're lucky we've got one in this screenshot. We've not done many formative evaluations. And doing this map has made me really emphasize the discoverability, accessibility role of maps, because one role of evaluation is lesson learning. The lesson learning function of evaluation is a global public good, but no one's learning lessons from evaluations that no one ever reads or knows about. And the vast majority of these evaluations shown in this map were not known about, not being read, not being used. So by putting them up there in the public domain through this map, they're now accessible. There's a master's program on monitoring evaluation at the University of the Institute of Management in Kampala in Uganda, and they're now using the map with their students. Whenever they have an assignment, they're told, well, go and find the evaluation in the map and use that evaluation as for the subject of this assignment. And they could have done that before, but they're all done on the same 1 or 2 evaluations that were commonly known about. Now all 500 are out there in the public domain. Again, this is one that's a map done mainly by website searching. Database searching is not the way to go about constructing a map like this, particularly with the process evaluations. It's based partly on, well, mainly on website searching. There's a number of locally commissioned studies. Locally commissioned studies by ministry or local NGOs are harder to find, may not be on websites. And there we worked with the Office of the Prime Minister in Uganda, who are our partner on doing the map. They contacted different ministries to collect the evaluation data commission that had over the last 18 years to include in the map. So you have to use different approaches for identifying the evidence for a map of this sort. But the interest and excitement over this map is has been very great, and so we expect to see many more maps of this sort going ahead. There's a zooming into the map. So we can see, for example, on education literacy, education outcomes, there are 23 studies, and you can see just above that the health and nutrition cell, where there are many more studies. So what's been done? One other thing we did, because you can code whatever you like. So one thing we coded was who the authors were, and what we found is that the vast majority of studies actually had no Ugandan authors. You can see from this, it's over 2/3 of studies had no Ugandan authors, which is quite scandalous. And you can pick on any item of interest when you're doing a coding, what's interesting to code. And people don't normally code nationality of study author. In a map like this, that's something that's interesting, so you can code it and present it like we do here. And so this slide alone, I think this slide was the most tweeted slide when I made the presentation map back in Uganda a couple of months ago, because there's something of great concern, of course, to local evaluators to see the way they're being bypassed in the production of local evaluation studies. What's being done with this map is where there's positive evidence, so in education, in governance, there are quite a lot of studies, so we can do country level evidence synthesis of those studies to see what we can learn from them, and we can see areas where there are evidence gaps, where there certainly aren't studies, to go ahead and commission more studies in those areas. I think really the next step for us is that many more countries are interested in having these maps, and we expect to see many more of them in the years to come. So in fact, we have now 18 ongoing maps. I presented a few of them. I'll just pick out one more that I mentioned at the start, and actually that's mentioned there, is the pathways for agricultural nutrition. And actually not even that map. So we have a map being done on methods, metrics, and tools looking at agriculture to nutrition. So they're not mapping what the evidence said, what evidence is available. They're mapping what metrics and tools and methods have been used to analyse agriculture nutrition linkages. This is being done by a research group who's interested in investing in developing or promoting the use of rigorous tools and metrics for looking at agricultural nutrition in developing countries. And so they're surveying all the existing tools to then do reviews of those tools to try and come to a conclusion on recommending which tools should be used. And I'm working with them on this map, and I can only say it's really, really needed, because there is a total proliferation of people, every research team inventing their own tool, and no coordination, no realising the economies of scale, no standardisation across teams. This actually is another finding disability map. That there's even though these Washington questions are meant to be used to assess disability, it's not being done, not being applied in a standard way. There's a need to converge around outcome measures in most areas, or also need to converge around the tools and the instruments being used, so you can actually get comparability of study findings, so you can actually compare effectiveness. So the map of methods, metrics, and tools is going to be very helpful in saying, clearly we need a review of this particular tool or tools doing this particular thing, so we can actually go dig a bit deeper into these tools and learn about them and how comparable they are. I mentioned the Violence Against Children map. We had a workshop a couple of weeks ago on violence against children, and there are half a dozen different survey instruments to measure violence against children. So again, I said, well, we need not just to map them, we need to do a review of them. Someone present said, oh, but actually we didn't invent our own. We looked at this tool and this and that instrument, we used them for one instrument, and no one else in the room knew that, even though they're meant to be experts in the area. So just by mapping them, you don't see actually these different instruments overlap. You need to go on and do the review. So this brings me very nicely to my last point, which is that evidence maps are an important building block in the evidence architecture. But they are that, they're building block. Evidence maps are not as a means to an end, they're not the end in themselves. So evidence maps can be used to commission reviews, and we've seen that used several times, identifying reviews to be commissioned, but in particular, they can help build evidence portals and to write guidelines and checklists. So this pyramid you see in front of you now is what I call the knowledge brokering pyramid. And it goes through different stages of knowledge brokering. As you go up the pyramid, knowledge is being more heavily brokered or translated. It's not the idea that the top layer of the pyramid is the best. It's not an evidence pyramid in that way. It's the most heavily brokered. So at the bottom level, we have data, and data is collected. Those data are analysed or translated into primary studies. Those primary studies are summarised in reviews, and reviews and studies go to databases, and subsections of those databases can be put into maps or script platforms. Then you have portals, guidelines, and checklists. And the important point is that maps take the users back to the original studies. Portals, guidelines, and checklists enable decision maker to make evidence-based decisions without having to go back and look at the original research. The best example of this is produced by the Webcast Center in the United Kingdom, the Education Down Foundation, which has a teacher and learning toolkit around to inform school-level decisions on interventions to adopt to improve learning outcomes. And so they identified 34 different interventions. We've asked, and for each of those 34 interventions, they commissioned systematic reviews, and they put this tool together that shows you in name of the intervention, what it costs in the range of £1 to £5 symbols, how strong the evidence is, then the impact. And the impact is the amount of additional learning outcomes a child gets from being exposed to this intervention. And you can sort by that, so you can see that giving a child feedback is very low cost, reasonable evidence, and is like getting an additional 8 months learning. So including feedback in your curriculum is a very powerful way of improving learning outcomes. By contrast, repeating a year, very expensive, and actually sets a child back by 4 months compared to what they would have been had they not been set back a year. It actually had an adverse effect on the child. Now, this is a very good tool that decision makers can make to decide what intervention to adopt in their school. And a report carried out in the UK National Audit Office, the equivalent of GAO in the US, carried out in 2015, found that nearly 2/3 of schools are using this toolkit to decide how to allocate school resources. That means 2/3 of schools in the UK are making evidence-based decisions based on systematic review evidence because they've got access to this tool, not because they're reading the research reports, because they don't need to. All they need to know is here. They can click down, read more about the intervention, they can click down and read the research reports, but they don't need to. This is all they need to see them. So this is one way of supporting decision making. Here's the evidence, you decide what to do. Another way is using, this is a homeless intervention tool. So I mentioned earlier, Work and What Works Centre on Homelessness do the same thing, and this is the prototype of the intervention tool that they have out there. So again, this example of evidence portable. Here's what the evidence says. Please go ahead and decide what to do. Another way of doing it is use guidelines. The next level up on my pyramid is guidelines, evidence-based guidelines. So this has been done for WHO for many years now, and this is a quote from WHO guidelines on producing guidelines. WHO guidelines on producing guidelines, so WHO guidelines have to be based on high quality systematic reviews. So what we're doing here is institutionalizing this evidence from systematic reviews. This is what we'd like to see happen in all sectors based on evidence portals, like the Teaching and Toolkit, or evidence-based guidelines, or checklists. Checklists are one level up in the pyramid. Guidance says, we've looked at the evidence, recommend do this. Checklists say, just do this. So checklists are based on the evidence. Here are the things you need to think about when you're designing a fall prevention program. So checklists are often ways to help you think about designing a program or intervention, often meant much more for practice than for program decisions. So as you go up the evidence broken pyramid, you go through different evidence decision making. The portals help decide what to do, And guidelines can do both what and how, and checklists are much more about how to do things. So their use is different, and they have different degrees of agency for the user. They're all ways of presenting evidence in ways that help it being used by the user in an evidence-based way, by the decision maker in an evidence-based way. And they all sit in this pyramid with data, rigorous studies at the bottom, reviews of those studies, and then you have databases and maps the foundation to allow you to identify where can we do reviews, where can we produce guidance, what sort of checklist should we produce. So key takeaway points are that maps are an interactive tool to make evidence discoverable, accessible, and usable. They can be applied to a range of research questions. So it's not just about effectiveness. We looked at process evaluations, we looked at formative evaluations, we looked at maps just as reviews. Just want that you have to put the evidence out there. So the relevant evidence you put in a map depends on the research question you want to address with that map. The scope of the map can be any sort of evaluation, any sort of research question. And they're a building block of EGMs architecture. People are very excited about them, they want to have them, but always ask them, well, what are you going to do with this map? They're about actually going to the next stage of getting evidence used. And the map in itself is not usually sufficient to get evidence used. There are people out there using maps for that purpose and guiding people to evidence-based areas, but really they're to get you to the next stage of doing reviews, building portals, and building those. I hope that's been a useful overview of maps. Read more about it again in our paper that I mentioned. Or visit our website. The Campbell website has more information available on it. And to mention also our What's Global Summit in Mexico this October, where there will be a lot of maps being presented. There'll be workshops in producing maps, and there'll be many presentations of ongoing and completed maps. So thank you, and back over to Joanne.
Well, thank you very much, Howard, for taking time to prepare and to give us this comprehensive overview and description of evidence gap maps and other reporting strategies such as toolkits, the guidelines, and checklists. I want to thank everyone for participating this afternoon. We don't have any time for a question and answer today, but please ask any questions you may have when you take a few minutes to give us some feedback about the webcast by filling out a brief evaluation. The link is listed here in the slides. We will be sending an email with the evaluation link to everyone who registered. Of course, you can also send your questions to us and we will get them to Howard. Finally, I want to thank all the AIR staff, along with Howard White and other representatives from the Campbell Collaboration who helped with planning and logistics. And of course, we want to thank NIDLR for their support to offer these webcasts and other events. We also want to invite you to attend the final webcast in this series, an overview of meta-analysis and effect size that will take place on Wednesday, June 19th at the same time. As a courtesy, everyone who registered for a previous session will be registered for all sessions in the series. We will be holding some follow-up activities as part of the training course, so information will come soon on how you can participate. Finally, we invite everyone to visit our recently refreshed and updated website at www.ktdrr.org. Thanks again, everyone, and good afternoon.